Hi, my name is Ben Hales and this is an exclusive video series for TournamentPokerEdge.com. In the series I'm going to be looking at how to get the most out of Hold'em Manager 2. In this first two parts of the series I'm going to focus on the HM2 heads-up display, or HUD as I'll refer to it from now on. In part 1 I'm going to give you a detailed walkthrough of how to set up and customize an HM2 HUD. And in part 2 I'm going to define and discuss many of the most commonly used statistics and give examples of how you might choose to use them to your benefit. This first part is going to appeal to those of you who have never used a HUD, or who want to learn more about how to build a HUD, or those who simply lack confidence on computers. The second part is going to be really useful for people who want to understand the various stats used on a HUD and how to use them. So let's begin. Once you've opened Hold'em Manager 2, you can immediately access the HUD Options button, which is located here on the main dashboard. I'm going to click on this now and open up a pop-up window, which is where you need to be to set up or make any changes to your HUD, or HUDs for those of you ambitious enough to have more than one. In the top left corner, you'll see a small image of what your current HUD looks like. This will continually change in appearance as you change your configuration. Before we begin customizing a HUD, let's click on the drop-down arrow to the right of the HUD image. This displays a list of all the currently saved HUDs on your computer. Helpfully, Hold'em Manager 2 comes with some preloaded HUD configurations. So for those of you who don't want to invest the time learning how to do it yourself, you can simply select and use a default HUD. Nevertheless, I highly recommend that you do spend some time playing around with this, as that is how you'll get the most out of your HM2 HUD. For now, I'm going to select the Harrington Basic default configuration and turn my attention to the 11 submenus on the left-hand side. The most important of these is the displayed stat screen, which is the first of the 11. Please note that if you close the HUD options window whilst in a different submenu by clicking OK, when you reopen the HUD options window like this, it will return to the submenu where you were last and not to the displayed stat screen. Returning now to the displayed stats screen, you'll notice 6 menu buttons at the top, including the slightly misleading button which says New. Actually, this would more accurately be Save, Save As, or Clone, as the only way to create a new configuration is by saving over a pre-existing one. Let me show you now as I change the file name of Harrington Basic to TPE. Click OK, and that saves it. If I look at that in the drop-down menu here with my saved configurations, you'll see it's just a direct copy of the Harrington Basic. If I now want to delete that, I just press delete and yes. This is quite a useful feature because you don't have to start from scratch. You can take a pre-existing configuration and use that HUD, tweak it slightly to your needs, and then save it as whatever you want. It can be useful having a selection of different HUDs if you play lots of different formats of the game or on different sites, or for example if you just want one HUD for normal play and a specialized HUD for heads-up play. The options exist to import and export HUDs. If you want to try out someone else's or share yours with a friend, this can be done straightforwardly using the import and export buttons. The Import 1.0 button is for importing a HUD configuration from the first version of Hold'em Manager. The Reset button I've never had cause to use, but you would use it either to reset all the configurations to the defaults, or simply to reset the panel positions of the HUD, which will make more sense to you when we look at the HM2 replayer in due course. Beneath the menu buttons are 2 boxes. The left-hand box contains the content of your HUD and is the real heart of the HUD options window. I'm going to explain what the various stats mean in part 2 of the series, but for now I want to make sure you know how to add, move around and remove the various different statistics. I'm going to click and highlight the total hands stat and show you how to move this up and down using the orange arrows at the base of the box like this. The total hands stat corresponds to the blue number 350 in the image box at the top left hand corner. Watch how it moves as I use the orange arrows. To remove a stat from your HUD, you simply select the stat you wish to remove. I'm going to choose win rate. Then you would click on the right hand arrow, the remove stat, at the base of the box here, and it would disappear. I'm not going to do this now. To add a stat to your HUD, you need to go to the right hand box and select the stat you wish to add. All stats are grouped, so you need to firstly click the appropriate group. Let's say you want to add a stat telling you how many big blinds each player has, to save you time calculating it at the table. This stat can be located in the miscellaneous group here. So you click on the miscellaneous and then click on the big blinds stat, and then at the base of the box there's an orange add stat arrow. You click on this, there we go, and your stat will appear on your HUD directly beneath the highlighted stat in the left hand box. If you don't like its position, you can of course move it up or down with the orange arrows. Sometimes it's not easy to find the stat you want, as there are literally hundreds of them. Be aware that you may need to use the scroll bar on the right hand side to aid your search. If you're still stuck, there is a search facility below the right hand box which you can activate by ticking the checkbox like this. You then need to type into the red box. So for example, if you wanted a stat telling you how often a player raised the flop, but you couldn't find it, you might type in flop raise into the box and you can see a list comes up, and if you find one that you think is appropriate, you can then select the stat and add it to your HUD using the orange arrow. If you build a complex HUD, you will also want to add new lines and panels, which can be done straightforwardly using the appropriate buttons in between the two boxes. These are very important for shaping the overall layout of the HUD. Watch the image box as I add a new line and a new panel, and you can see how this changes the layout of your HUD. If I remove them, look how it changes. The remaining checkboxes at the bottom of the displayed stats menu should generally be checked. You will want the HUD to launch when you open Holdem Manager, so that you don't need to manually launch it from the main screen. If I close the HUD options window by clicking OK, you can see the Start HUD and Stop HUD buttons. This is where you can manually turn the HUD on and off. I'm now going to go back to the HUD options window and click on the second submenu on the left hand side, the Stat Appearance. Each stat on your HUD can and should be carefully color-coded to help your brain's speed of thought at the table. I'm going to discuss this in more detail in the second part of this video series, but for now, let's just deal with how to change the appearance of a stat. I'm going to make some changes to the total hands stat, so I need to click and highlight it. Now, any changes I make in the color range and stat settings boxes will only change the total hands stat. If I want to make changes to any other individual stat, I need to firstly click on them and then make the changes. Remember, the stat total hands corresponds to the 350 in blue in the top left image. Currently the blue colour applies to all numbers, so it appears in this colour regardless of whether you have 0 hands on an opponent or 10,000. To simply change the blue to another colour, you can either click on the default colours drop down arrow at the top of the screen like this. I select the green here, watch the image change in the top left hand corner, and now as I turn it back to blue you can watch it again. Or alternatively, you can click on the colour you want to change and open a window here. This gives you the chance to choose your custom colour. I like the blue, so I'm not going to change this now. The colour range box is really important and very easy to use once you've got the hang of it. You always have at least one active colour, which in this case is being applied to an infinite range. There are 4 on and off buttons which can be turned on in sequence to generate up to 4 additional colour ranges. I'm going to turn on the first button, the left hand one, which automatically creates 2 different ranges with 2 different colours. Already I can see some benefit in this. The HUD will now display players with whom you have played less than 50 hands in light blue and players with whom you have played more than 50 hands in darker blue. If you like this colour scheme, you can extend it further. I'm now going to turn on the next button to add an additional colour range. You now have 3 shades of blue, which makes good sense to me. The darker the shade, the more hands you have on your opponent. But I don't really like the parameters. I want to increase the numbers. So you need to click on the relevant boxes and manually change the numbers to the ones you want. I'm going to choose 50 and 150. I might even decide to add a 4th. I just paused the video there briefly whilst I finished the job, and you'll notice now that I've got 5 shades of blue set up and 4 different parameters in the boxes. So for example, the 4,000, if I've got more than 4,000 hands on a player, I'll see it appear in dark blue, and I'll know that I can start analysing this player in quite a lot of depth because I've got so many hands on him. I can use some of the more complex statistics. This is useful to me whilst I'm at the table. And in light blue, I'll know that really I shouldn't be paying too much attention to any of the statistics because I don't have a large enough sample size. This, for me, is really useful, and you might want to copy this type of color scheme on the total hands stat. You might want to choose your own. You can use default colors, or you can set your own up. I'm going to discuss how to choose sensible ranges and colors for each of the most common statistics in the second part of the video. When you're setting up your HUD, it is really important that you color code each and every one of your stats. It does take time and effort, but you only need to do it once. You can also change the font by clicking on the font button here. I'm not going to change this now, but it's pretty straightforward, you can see. Below font, you'll see a drop-down arrow for choosing which pop-up box this stat is associated with. I briefly need to explain what a pop-up box is, and I'll be discussing them in more detail. I just started to observe a live PokerStars match with my Harrington Basic HUD on, and all I'm going to do now is just show you what a pop-up box is. So if I go to any of the stats and hover over it, then a pop-up box appears. It gives me much more detailed information about that particular stat and many of the other stats. It's not something that you want on all the time because it's too big, and as you can see covers half the screen, but it is useful information that you can gather whilst you're playing. The pop-up boxes are pre-formatted, pre-categorized in Holdem Manager 2, but they are customizable. You can build your own, and we're going to look at that later on. So if we look back at the pop-up drop-down arrow here, we can see the default categories available, and we can choose the one that we want to associate each stat with. So for example here, we've got the total VPIP stat highlighted, and we're choosing which pop-up window appears when we hover over it in the HUD when we're playing live, or on the replayer when we're looking at it on the replayer. I'm personally happy with the total VPIP to appear in the default VPIP pop-up window, and for most of you, you're also going to be happy to leave these exactly as you find them. The defaults that Holdem Manager 2 has set up work pretty well, but it is fully customizable if you want to change it. For the minority of players who do decide they want to customize their pop-up boxes, this is where you would come to assign each stat to a given pop-up window. How many decimal places you wish to see for each given stat can be adjusted in the next drop-down box located here. For the majority of stats, this is going to be set to 0, and there's rarely going to be a need to change this, as the defaults are generally how you would want them. I'm now going to highlight the post-flop aggression factor stat, and you will notice that the default is set to 1 decimal place. This is perfect, as most players' aggression factor will lie between 1 and 10, so seeing 1 decimal place makes good sense. Below the decimal places is the abbreviation box. The aggression factor stat on this HUD is currently abbreviated to /AF, the / acting as a segregator from the previous stat. You can view how this appears in the image window here. If I now change the abbreviation to AG like this, the image window won't automatically update the information. You will need to close the whole window by clicking OK, reopen HUD options, and then you should be able to view the change. As you can see, the / separator has disappeared and the new AGG abbreviation is in place, looking quite ugly. To change it back, I need to click again on the post-flop aggression factor stat and repeat the process. So /AF, OK, reopen HUD options, and there it is, reappeared exactly as it was before. If you now look across at the min samples on the right hand side, you can enter a number of samples value into this box. You might want to use this so as to avoid looking at stats with only 5 or 10 examples and being misled by insufficient data. If you have a smaller sample size than your minimum requirement, then that stat will appear as a dash on your HUD instead of a value. Alternatively, you can check the dim for sample size tick box above, and the stat will appear, but will be appearing in a lighter color. Your own personal stats can be displayed on the HUD and are known as the Hero HUD. If I just jump forward briefly to the Config Properties submenu, you can see this checkbox under HUD Settings. This can be used to turn your Hero HUD on and off. I like to leave mine on, so I'm going to leave this box unchecked. Returning now to the Stat Appearance submenu, you'll notice that for each stat you can choose whether to display for hero, display for opponents, or both. Most likely you'll leave both boxes checked for all your stats and keep your HUD the same. But if, for example, you wanted to reduce the number of stats on the HUD hero, you could uncheck the Display for Hero tick box for any stats that you wish to remove from the hero's HUD. I'm going to leave mine alone. The third submenu on the left-hand side is Config Properties, which is really useful for altering the overall appearance of your HUD. All of the default HUDs use a plain black background, which is going to suit most people. But let's try changing the background now. If you click on the background, it opens up a familiar window. You can now change the color and/or the opacity. The opacity is how transparent or see-through the HUD background is. Many people do like to be able to see through the HUD so it doesn't hide any other information on the poker table. I'm going to move the opacity slider to the right to make the HUD more transparent. To test how this looks, you can't rely on the image in the top left-hand corner. When testing out opacity, you are much better off looking at the HM2 replayer. So let's do that now. First, I'm going to close the HUD options menu by clicking OK at the bottom, and from the main menu I then need to move away from the Home tab at the top and click on the Reports tab. Notice I'm also in the Tournament section. If you're a tournament player, you should be highlighting this and not the cash. What I'm looking for is this replayer icon at the bottom of the screen. This is the simplest way of entering the replayer. So single click, and this rewind icon is what we're clicking. Inside the replayer, which I'm going to discuss in much more detail in another video in this series, we can now see the look of our new HUD. We can see the opacity. Do we like it like this? Do we want to compare it perhaps to the plain black default look? If we wanted to do that, we just click on the X to close the replayer, go back to HUD options and back into the background, move the opacity slider back so that the HUD is no longer see-through, click on OK, OK again, replayer icon, and now you can see the plain black. I prefer the plain black. I'm going to stick with that, and you can choose what you prefer. The advantage of the see-through is of course that you can see some of the table behind the HUD. Returning now to the HUD options and the config properties submenu, you'll see the alternative background can also be changed in exactly the same way as the background. This is of much less importance because we don't tend to use the alternative background very often in Hold'em Manager 2. The text itself is much more important. This consists of the stat abbreviations and any separators you choose to use. On a dark background, you're going to want a light color, so white is a good choice. I'm going to click on the color now and change it. I could go in here to change it to a dark yellow or a light yellow color maybe, or I could just use this yellow at the bottom, which is a default choice. So let's do that. I click here, click OK, and you'll notice that nothing's changed in the image box, so you need to click OK at the bottom, go back in, and the changes will have taken place. So now in the image box in the top left, you can see the separators and the abbreviations are in this bright yellow color. I quite like that, so I'm going to stick with it. Underneath you can change the font, and if you do want to really personalize your HUD, this is a good place to do it, I suggest. If you want to change the opacity of your HUD, you can do it here, but I advise strongly not to. It makes much more sense to change the opacity within the background color as I showed you before. Doing it here will cause your entire HUD overlay, including the stats themselves, to fade away, which is not ideal. At the bottom you can see you have the option of enabling or disabling mucked cards. If you want to turn it off, you can simply set the display time to 0 like this, and if you want to turn it on, choose how many seconds you want it displayed for. You can also change the opacity for this feature, whether to display your own muck cards, and whether to display the won or lost label. The HUD settings box starts with the No Hero HUD checkbox, which we looked at before. The second checkbox is called Use Session Stats, and you would only tick this box if you didn't want to use any historical data from your opponents. If you do check this box, you'll find your HUD will display your alternative background color, which is red by default. The Show Note icon refers to the little notepad which I'm hovering over in the image box now. You can turn this on and off here, and I'll discuss how you might use it later on. I recommend leaving it checked along with the next box, the Show Auto Rate icon, which denotes the asterisk that I'm hovering over in the image box now. The following checkbox is very important, so pay very close attention. You need to decide whether or not to display abbreviations for your HUD stats. This is a really important choice. Beginners are going to tend to want to check this box. The benefit of having them turned on is that you can see at a glance which stat refers to what number. The drawback is that it takes up space on your HUD. If you have a small HUD like this one, space is less of an issue. But look what happens if I change to the Harrington Advanced HUD. On this HUD, you just haven't got enough room to display abbreviations. Instead, you might choose to learn the positions of each individual stat through practice and sacrifice the luxury of having the abbreviations displayed. If you choose not to show your abbreviations, you will need an alternative way of separating the list of numbers. The separator drop-down box here contains some options. The asterisk is quite nice, as you can see there, but my favourite remains the /, so I'm going to choose that one. The next two boxes I have only ever had set to 0. You can set a minimum hands value so that the HUD will not appear until the minimum hands requirement has been met. This might be useful to avoid being misled by a small sample size. The overhang sets the maximum amount of pixels the overhang can hang on the table. I've just started observing a live game on PokerStars, so I can introduce you to the summary HUD, which is completely different to the rest of the panels and provides average statistics for the table, along with information on the last pots won. Here it is. You can see the last 2 pots won here. If we go back to the HUD options, this drop-down arrow here gives you the option to change how many last hands are displayed on our summary HUD. So if I change that to 3 and click OK, then go back to the game that we were looking at, you'll now see that in real time there are now 3 last pots won displayed. The next feature of the HUD settings allows you to set one color code for the summary HUD to highlight large pots. This is useful for those of you who multi-table and sometimes miss some action, as you can see at a glance that someone has won a large pot. I'm going to set it to greater than 30 big blinds and assign a really garish color to grab my attention. If I press OK on that and then go into a live game, then I can see at a glance on the summary HUD that there's a couple of small pots and one large pot appears in the pink at the top. This is very easy to see at a glance and just allows you to pick up on any action you might have missed. Now let's say I wanted to get some more information on the hand that is highlighted in pink there. There are 3 basic ways of doing that. I can go into the PokerStars replayer by finding the hand here and visualizing it and replaying the hand like this, or I can click on the hand and open up the hand viewer in HM2, or I can replay the hand by clicking on the settings tab here and replay. I'm replaying like this. That opens up the replayer in Hold'em Manager 2. All of these things can distract you from the game in hand, but if you particularly want to find out some information on a hand that's just gone by, these are 3 different ways of doing it. Returning now to the Config Properties submenu, you ought to keep the Settings HUD Select tick box checked if you want to be able to change settings or change HUD whilst playing. I sometimes like to change to a heads-up HUD when we're down to just 2 players, so I need this box checked. Some of the more technical settings are within the general settings box. I'll do my best to explain some of these. When you hover over a stat, a pop-up box appears, as we saw earlier. The pop-up hover time can be adjusted to increase or decrease the hover time needed before the pop-up appears. Some of you might want to adjust this because it can be a bit annoying waiting a split second or 2 before it appears. On the other hand, if they're popping up all over the place whilst you're moving your mouse around the screen, that's no good. So you could experiment with that and see what suits you. HUD logging should only be checked if you're having technical problems and wish to create log files for debugging purposes. No HUD stats without hero data. It does what it says. If you tick this box and you're just observing a table, no HUD stats will appear. It's normally possible to move around the HUD layout whilst playing live or within the Hold'em Manager replayer, but checking this box prevents you from doing so. I guess this might be useful if you were very confident with your existing layout and you didn't want to accidentally damage it, but for most people you're going to want to leave this unchecked in case you need to make adjustments during play. Let me show you how to move the panels around. If we just go into the replayer, come on replayer, there we go. Then what you do really is you just right click on a bit of the background here and you can move this around and then drag it with the right click held down and you can move it to another place on the screen. This is quite useful if you find that your HUD is overlapping onto something important like the number of chips someone's holding or the hole cards themselves. Then you need to obviously move these panels around, and you can do that with the right click and the drag and drop. Returning now to the HUD options and the general settings, the next 3 tick boxes I have ticked. The first 2 of them are not ticked by default. I like having my pop-up windows have some color in them, so that's why I've got this checked. If you check the color pop-up stats, any stats which you have color codes for will also appear color coded in the pop-up boxes. Most people don't have this checked, I think because they've not thought to check it, but I like it and I'm going to leave mine on. It gives some color and a bit of highlighting to the pop-up windows themselves, not just color on the HUD, color on the pop-ups. The following one is a personal thing. I like having this one checked. It means that I have to manually click on a stat on my HUD if I want to see a pop-up box. Hovering over the stat will not be enough to cause a pop-up box to appear. The advantage of this is that you don't get annoying pop-up boxes appearing if you accidentally hover over a stat. For me, this gives me greater control of my screen when I'm playing poker, and that's why I like it. Auto Z order is a technical setting which is ticked by default, and you should leave it ticked. There are plans to remove this setting anyway. The always on top checkbox might be necessary to tick on certain sites, depending on whether those sites have graphics which interfere with the HM2 HUD. If you ever find something is covering the HM2 HUD, try clicking on this box and it should solve the problem. If you check the active only box, stats will only be shown on the table that was last clicked. The final checkbox simply caps percentages at 99%, so your stats can only reach 99 and never 100. That concludes this submenu. We're now going to move on to the site options. The Site Options menu allows you to configure different HUD settings, not just for different sites, but different game types. You could have one PokerStars full ring HUD and another PokerStars 6 max HUD, and if you set this up properly, Hold'em Manager will know which one you want. If you play cash games, you can have what are called street by street HUDs, and there are instructions on screen for how to set this up. Note that this is not available currently for tournament players, which is why I don't have it set up already. Let's practice setting up a configuration. First, I choose my site, PokerStars. Then my game type, let's choose, heads up. Then my game, Hold'em, betting, you can include if you want. I'm going to leave it as any, and street is not going to be applicable for tournament players. So after you've done that, you then go to the list of pre-saved configurations and choose the one you want to make the rule for. In this case, heads up, and at the bottom you'll see now there is a new rule. If I open a PokerStars heads up game and it's Hold'em, this is the default HUD that Hold'em Manager will know I want to play with. To delete this, I simply highlight the rule that I don't want and click on the X button like this. The live tracking in the bottom right hand corner enables pot odds to be displayed whilst you are playing or on the replayer. I'm not a fan myself, but the facility is there for those who want to use it. The fifth submenu of the HUD options deals with seating preferences. It is important to ensure that any settings you have saved in your poker client marry up with the settings in Hold'em Manager 2. Fortunately, HM2 recognizes these settings and automatically resolves the issue for you. So unless you run into a particular problem with a particular site, you are unlikely to have to use this menu at all. If you do run into a problem, the on-screen instructions are fairly comprehensive, as you can see here. We looked briefly at what a pop-up box looks like earlier. The next submenu is called Pop-up Designer and will appeal to advanced players who are not satisfied with the default pop-ups and want their own designs. I use the defaults, so for help building your own pop-ups, I would refer you to the Hold'em Manager website. I'm going to skip forward now to the 8th submenu and introduce you to the main pop-up window. First, let's have a look what this actually is and how it differs from a normal pop-up window. I'm quickly going to change the HUD to a slightly different one and open up the replayer. Just remind ourselves of what a normal pop-up window looks like. So I'm going to click on the VPIP stat here, and you'll notice that the pop-up window appears with lots and lots of different stats, but the VPIP stats are highlighted and in larger font. I've also got the color added in, which is a feature that I like, but this is really useful for when you're playing live. To see the main pop-up window, you can click on the name of the player on your HUD, or you can, if you might not have the name of the player on your HUD, you can also click on the black background, which will bring up the main pop-up box. As you can see, this one, the default main pop-up, has 5 tabs, and you can build this yourself. You can make it look like completely different if you want, but these default ones are pretty good. And the 5 tabs at the top, you can navigate them like this and see all sorts of different stats. Often the stats themselves are then broken down by position. Having them all available on one window is very useful. though I must admit I do use it less frequently than normal pop-up windows. Usually what I want to see at a glance is whether my opponent is positionally aware or not. So now that you know what the main pop-up window is, if we return to the sub-menu in the HUD options, you'll see, when it finally appears, that this screen just deals with which stats appear on that main pop-up window. It's fairly straightforward to make any personal adjustments to the default, though I must admit I have never felt the need. So here it finally is. The displayed stats at the top we looked at before. It's very similar in its design here, with the orange arrows for moving, adding and removing the various different stats to the tabs and the table stats. Before I look at the Chart Designer submenu, I want to change my HUD to the Graphs HUD, which comes as one of the defaults. This is not a HUD I have ever actually used at the tables, but I think there are some people who are going to prefer looking at bar charts than at numbers. At first it looks a bit strange, but don't dismiss it outright, as it does have a lot of value. Let's look at it on the replayer. To change HUDs whilst you're in the replayer, you click on this drop down arrow and select the HUD that you want, in this case Graphs. If a player is performing a stat more than average, the bar moves to the right. Less than average, the bar moves to the left. So we get a visual overview of a player very quickly. In the Chart Designer, you can choose two different chart types: horizontal bars, which is what we just looked at, or bars from origin. Let's see what this looks like. Now you can see on the replay the bars are simpler. If they are short, the player performs that stat less than average. If in the middle, he performs it an average amount, and if the bar is long, he performs it more than average. If you like these bars, you can add, move, and remove stats, and you can change the abbreviation text and colors. So the Chart Designer submenu is where you come to edit and customize your graph HUD. Don't forget, once you've finished, you can save the settings by going back to the Displayed Stats menu here, clicking on New, and choosing a new name for your HUD configuration. This is a good way of saving things as you go along in case you make a mistake and you're not sure how to undo it. I'm not going to be discussing NoteCADDY in this video series, so let's move straight on to the HUD filters. This is an important subscreen for tournament players with large databases. If 5 players are dealt into a hand, you don't necessarily want data which includes full ring action. So what you might do is change the parameters to include stats where there are only 4 to 6 players dealt into the hand. So if I do this now, you get the idea. Now the number of stats I'm returning is vastly reduced, and this is a drawback. The stats are much more relevant to the situation you find yourself in, but filtering stats like this might cause you to not have enough sample size to make it worthwhile. It's certainly a good idea to use this filter for your heads up hands. I think players play very differently when they're playing heads up, so almost resetting the stats when you arrive at a heads up situation and just gathering information on how they play heads up can be much more beneficial than having it cluttered up with hands from during normal play. Note that it is also possible here to filter by date. Mine is set to include all hands, but you could set this to say 12 months or 6 months for those of you who are playing a lot, and that way you're not littering your database full of very old statistics. And players, you know, they do improve, they do change styles, so having hands from 4 or 5 years ago may not be that beneficial. I'm just going to put this back to 2 and 10. I prefer it like this. You can also filter by the number of hands, the last 10,000 hands or 20,000 hands, something like that. Perhaps less likely than the date, but the option is there for you. The final submenu is another friend to the tournament players with millions of hands. It allows you to filter data by the number of big blinds a player is holding. The most obvious use for this would be to differentiate between the stats of a player with 12 big blinds or less and the same player with 12 big blinds or more. You are going to want a decent sample size before you start trying this, but let's give it a brief go. The left hand side refers to the number of big blinds a player has, so if he has less than 12 big blinds, you might change the minimum and the maximum to 1 and 12. I'm going to do this now. That way, when he's in a push-fold situation, you're only getting data for when the player has been short-stacked. For the larger stack sizes, you might as well leave them alone at the default of 1 to 81 values, unless you have masses of data and know all your opponents very well. To conclude this video, let's go back to the replayer and have a look at some finished HUDs to inspire you all to build some of your own. This is the HUD I generally use on the tables. 3 lines, colourful and very traditional looking. Then there's the graphs option, which we looked at before. Why not experiment around with this? The Harrington Basic, good for beginners, using just the core stats. The Harrington Intermediate and the Harrington Advanced, you can see here, similar in style and layout, but with an increased number of stats and a more cluttered up screen. This one is slightly different in style, with the HUD appearing as a square box. And this one is specifically designed for heads-up play, dividing stats up by position. If you're playing heads-up, there's plenty of space for a complex HUD. The final one I'm going to show you is different again in design, longer and thinner, and including some abbreviations. Hopefully that should give you a few ideas. You should now know everything there is to know about the mechanics of setting up an HM2 HUD. What you need to know now is what all the stats mean and how to use them. This is what I'm going to cover in the second part of the series. My name is Ben Hales. You can find my details at tournamentpokeredge.com. Thank you very much for watching.